Okay, we're going live now.
Okay, so hi, my name is Sebastian Badin. I'm a founding member of Historical Materialism Journal and the book series and the conferences, some of which you will already be familiar with. So I wanted just to pitch to you the idea of you subscribing to the journal. Firstly, the journal comes out 4 times a year, published by Brill, over 1,000 pages of extremely important and stimulating Marxist theory and Marxist history. We have a discount at the moment for individual subscribers around the time of the London conference, and we very strongly both request and demand that you subscribe to the journal, that you get other people to subscribe to the journal, and of course that you get your institution, if you're part of a university or other institution, to subscribe to the journal. We need more subscribers for this project to be able to expand and continue. The second thing I really wanted to push was the book series. The book series you'll also probably be familiar with. It's published by Brill Academic Press, and then the volumes come out 12 months later with Haymarket Books in Chicago, paperbacks. We have more than 200 volumes published now, translations of original work, of document collections, of translations from Marxist theory from across the world, from Japan to China, to India, to Latin America, very important Latin American list shaping up in the book series, and so on. It's a really crucial intervention in Marxist literature and in making Marxist theory available. That really hasn't existed on this scale since the 1970s. So we'd like you to look at the book series, buy individual volumes, perhaps take up the offer of the book club that Haymarket is promoting. And also, of course, again, if you're part of an institution, to get your institution to buy as many volumes as possible. Those are the 2 key elements of our activity, aside from the conferences, the journal and the book series. And we think it would be, it's essential basically for us, for our existence, for us to be able to continue to thrive, for those to expand. So please subscribe to the journal, buy the books in the book series, publicize both around you, and help us build the Historical Materialism project.
Welcome everyone to this session of the conference. Thank you for joining us. My name is Sai Englert. I'm a member of the editorial board of HM, and very happy and excited to chair this session and hear the kind of excellent papers that we have lined up for you today. So without further ado, I'll move to introducing our speakers very briefly and give you a sense of the papers that they will be presenting. And we will then hear the 3 papers for about 15 minutes each. And after that, there will be time for discussion, questions, etc. You can use the chat, which you should see below the screen throughout the session. So if you have questions or remarks that come up as somebody is speaking, please put them in the chat. And the speakers will then have the opportunity to return to them afterwards. So we will take the papers in order in which they are in your program. So our session today has the kind of collective title of States and Geopolitics. The first paper is titled Regimes of Extreme Permission, State Corporate Repression and the Realization of Neocolonial Accumulation in Southeast Asia. Our presenter today will be Joe Greener, and his co-author, Pablo from the University of Singapore, will not be joining us today. And Joe himself is from the University of Liverpool, who have recently won a really important industrial dispute. So also congratulations to Joe for that. The second paper will be Agency in the Periphery, the controversy between Marini and Cardoso in geopolitical terms, presented by Rafael Alexandre Mello from the University of Brasília and Pedro Salgado from the Federal University of Bahia and the University of Brasília. And then last but not least, we will hear Conceptualizing Institutional Disobedience in a Context of Authoritarian Neoliberalism, the Catalan case, presented by Monica Clua-Losada from the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley in the USA, and Clara Calvet from the Universitat de Barcelona in Spain, and Shaun McCrory, their third co-author, won't be joining us today. I should also add that both Monica and Clara are organizers of HM Barcelona, which had a very successful conference this summer, and the next conference will be held in 2023. So if you've missed it, I'm afraid you'll have to patiently wait for the next, no doubt, excellent conference. So those are the papers. I will now pass on to our speakers, and please make sure to put comments and questions in the chat as we go along. So Joe, you can kick us off.
Is that sharing?
Yes, it is.
Is that sharing? Is that sharing the slides? Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Okay. So I had a bit of a glitch there. Just to correct you slightly there, Si, we're both at the University of Liverpool, but we're both based in Singapore. So the University of Liverpool has a small campus in Singapore. But anyway, so the paper I'm presenting today is some work we're doing, really engages with two sort of geopolitical theories around neo-imperialism and contributes to thinking around neo-imperialism. I guess what we're trying to contribute to the debate is a little bit how some of the politics and state power works around accumulation. So whereas, as I'll discuss shortly, you know, across the Marxist literature, there's a lot of good sort of fairly recent theories about the nature of neo-imperialism. And I guess what we're trying to color in there is something about how state power and may work and operate differently when we're talking about sort of neo-imperialist forms of accumulation. So what I'll be discussing is two case studies, really, which we're calling sort of regimes of extreme permission, which is palm oil and export processing zones across the Mekong region and palm oil in Indonesia, palm oil plantations. So basically what we're going to argue is that when we go to the global south, we find specific forms of state power, which are often especially or kind of like over repressive, violent, and sometimes even blurring on illicit. Not that these don't exist in the north, but these are more likely to happen when we're talking about kind of global south forms of accumulation, which are more embedded in terms of or have kind of neo-imperialist or neo-colonial structures to them. And in particular, we'll sort of talk about how sort of hegemony or kind of like the capacity for specific accumulation strategies to achieve hegemony tends to be more fractured and unstable in the global south. And this is due to the kind of nature of the type of permission that corporations are seeking in terms of accumulation in the south. So yeah, so basically we're building on something that comes from state crime, sort of state crime theory. It's kind of like, it's got sort of one foot in critical criminology in a sense, but it's definitely sort of also somewhat Marxist in its orientation. So Steve Toombs, Dave White, Bernat, they've kind of coined this term regimes of permission, which is a kind of state corporate crime way of thinking about the relationship between states and corporations. Particularly in the production and management of the kind of harmful effects of accumulation. And what they're arguing with the term, which is kind of captured in the term regimes of permission, is that states have this symbiotic relationship to corporations. So state capacities are fundamental to securing kind of socio-spatial infrastructure for accumulation. So if we think of the role of the state, then it's involved in supporting, like shoring up kind of like the training of labor, or creating the physical infrastructure needed for accumulation, or developing certain tax regimes. This infrastructure, as how they've described it, they will often sort of more talk about issues of consent and how states sort of work with corporations to achieve kind of hegemonic or hegemony for particular accumulation. So there might even be, in a sense, concessions to dimensions of civil society, or concessions to labor or the environment at times. And regulation, one of the key things they're arguing is that regulation is not like the state acting against corporations, but it may be sort of like mitigating some of the most harmful effects of accumulations at times to sort of shore up the overall system of accumulation. In a sense, states might also kind of be involved in creating discourses about the acceptability of different regimes of accumulation. So basically, in their original sort of specification of regimes of permission, they were sort of quite concerned with talking about how states achieve hegemony, or help corporations to achieve hegemony for particular accumulation strategies. However, what we're sort of suggesting is that their notion of regimes of permission is somewhat northern, developed, orientated, and that hegemony is either often not achieved, or I guess what we're suggesting is more fractured in southern contexts. So really the question we're asking is, are state capacities operating differently when we consider corporate accumulation, which has neocolonial or neo-imperialist logics? So is hegemony for accumulation achieved? Can we even talk about hegemony if we're talking about extractive and export forms of industrialization and the periphery? Can we even talk about sort of hegemony, or is it just more coercive in a sense? If there is hegemony for these accumulation strategies, does it work differently when we're actually including a kind of the fact that these accumulation strategies are not only sort of forms of class exploitation, they're sort of forms of class exploitation plus imperialist exploitation. So imperialism, so my kind of work and definition quickly is from John Smith. So imperialism is the subjugation of the entire world to the interests of the capitalist ruling classes of a handful of oppressor nations. So more on John Smith in a minute, but John Smith's arguing that that it's not only, when we consider kind of the global capitalism today, we can't just think of the class relation. We also have to think of the class relation in terms of its kind of relation to imperialist structures as well. So regimes of extreme permission, so rather than regimes of permission, but regimes of extreme permission, which might be more dominant or evident in the global south, are still dependent on intentional deployment of state powers. So that's one thing we want to be clear, is we're not arguing that the state is not there in the south, but maybe there's a different kind of state power often at work in terms of supporting and reproducing different forms of accumulation. So weakening or rearticulation of the legitimation functions of the state. So the state finds it more difficult to achieve kind of consolidations of legitimacy, I guess. So what you find is more coercion, less consent, more domination, less hegemony. That's kind of our contention here. So yeah, as I said, neo-imperialist accumulation strategies involve extra exploitation, you could argue. So not only class, but also exploitation based on inequalities between nations, and the sort of intersecting on that, the global hierarchy of race. And we're sort of taking two concepts of neo-colonialism. And the first, we're borrowing John Smith's super exploitation to think about export processing zones. So John Smith argues that there's kind of third form of surplus value that gets left out of absolute and relative surplus value, and he calls this kind of global labor arbitrage. So this is the sourcing of overexploited or over-repressed labor paid under the value of reproduction. In particular, that would be an important point. So wages don't even cover kind of socially necessary labor time. And so outsourcing is the key kind of mode at which capital finds this extra source of surplus value. And so what then associated with this is this huge sort of redistribution of value towards northern states and corporations away from global south regions. John Smith, in his excellent book, goes through a few different examples of this, but probably one of the clearest is if you think of a t-shirt in the global south, you find that much of the value of the sort of much of the price of the t-shirt in the kind of Western shop actually goes to different economic processes that are happening in the global north rather than the global south. So rents, marketing, design, people working in retail, even the global north state will get a lot of that money because there's various different taxes and all these things. So there's a kind of like concealed value redistribution that goes on when commodities are made in the global south but consumed in the global north. This is what John Smith's saying. This is the nature of this type of neo-imperialism that he's describing through the concept of global labor arbitrage. Wages and rent. So yeah, I better move on. And the second one we're thinking about is ecological imperialism, which is usually associated with Clark and Foster. So this is sort of associated with this idea that capital is unable to realize a kind of ecologically reproductive metabolism. That's not quite the language I'm looking for, but basically capitalism is, cannot achieve a metabolic, it has innately a metabolic rift. It can't have a mode of accumulation which is conducive with protecting or sustaining the ecologies. But what we often see today is that imperialist activities or ecological imperialism, to pin it down a bit more carefully, is the deliberate sort of process of exporting problematic or ecologically damaging or ecocidal kind of processes to global south regions. So kind of like exploiting existing global inequalities to overcome or redistribute environmental contradictions. So we're using Southeast Asia to explore some of these processes of neocolonialism and the politics attached to it. And the two sort of case studies that are informing our kind of theoretical argument is looking firstly at export processing zones for cut mate trim garment production in the greater Mekong subregion, and then palm oil plantations in Indonesia. So the first regime of extreme permission, which is export processing zones, what we find with these, in that map there, you can see just kind of the overall kind of broad picture of where in the Mekong region we find a lot of export processing zones. State buyer creates social spaces. So again, the state is very active really in export processing zones and creating kind of exceptionality. Yeah. So these spaces require kind of socio-legal regimes, labor regimes, the development of physical infrastructure. States create this as a kind of exceptional space, specifically for kind of low-end garment production. Interestingly, this has been organized through this the Greater Mekong Subregion Project, which is arguably basically an arm of the Asian Development Bank. It's the Asian Development Bank based in the Philippines, but they also get a lot of money from Japanese and Taiwanese capital and these kind of various partnerships. But arguably the kind of Greater Mekong Subregion Project has undermined kind of like local state agreements on sort of land rights, labor rights, and so on. So the nature of this regime of extreme permission, if we, Pablo and I conducted really extensive literature searches on labor conditions and so on, in export processing zones, we find that like there's substantial evidence of below subsistence wages across the industry, including unpaid wages. It's kind of the entire system tends to exploit kind of gendered inequality. So there's various sorts of gendered harms in terms of both wage differentials, little to no support for childcare, sexual violence, exploitation is fairly common across different garment production in these sorts of export processing zones across the Mekong. Even from their inception, you find commonly the flouting of like communal land agreements, so sort of like established agreements on compensation and compensation consultation around developing the land. These are usually flouted, these are usually undermined. Illegal measures by employers to prevent union formation action, use of violence to quell worker uprisings, particularly interesting in Cambodia. Many of these, there's one in particular that's quite a lot written by Mae Sot, which is actually in Thailand, but just near the border with Myanmar. It's basically completely dependent on sort of irregular workers from Myanmar. So actually, it's often a kind of migrant worker system. You can also see from the map that they are often sort of built right next to borders to exploit cheaper labor that might be just over the other side of the border. And even most recently, the system, the kind of like the realities of garment production was kind of exposed during COVID because many of the workers were not paid wages and were thrust into even more severe poverty. But again, so I guess these require kind of intensive state power. So I'm on 40 minutes, so I'm gonna have to be quick. Palm oil, so we also looked at Indonesia and again, a sort of extensive literature review on kind of conditions and the role of the state in sort of palm oil production. Again, this regime of extreme permission was all about sort of flouting agreements on deforestation and indigenous rights, lots of land grabbing, even once palm oil plantations are built, are developed, these are often defined by like child labor, toxic and unsafe working conditions. Tanya Lee, a sort of anthropologist, talks about how social relations in the palm oil become sort of predatory. So everything becomes defined by swindling, corruption, and so on. So just to finish, so stay within the time, just about. So what we're suggesting is that both these regimes of extreme permission are kind of neo-imperialist in the sense that they can both be considered actually to include kind of dimensions of super exploitation and ecological imperialism, but obviously the export processing zone more better embodies super exploitation probably, and the palm oil situation more embodies ecological imperialism. But in both cases though, regulatory environments are created deliberately by the state. So the regime of extreme permission is deliberately architectured by the state. These are sites of intense accumulation, which are constantly plagued with illegitimacy and inability to secure stable hegemony in both cases. The problem, so we would argue the problem is not weak states or lack of regulatory enforcement. Indeed, state capacities are intimately involved in producing reps and creating and sustaining reps. So state power realizes particular strategies which emerge from the problem of hegemony legitimacy for these forms of neo-imperialist accumulation. So in the export processing zone is this constant attempt to create exceptionality. So the zone is imagined to be sitting outside the nation state, even though obviously it physically doesn't sit outside the nation state, but it's regulation wise, it's sort of constructed as if it's not in the nation state. In the Indonesian example, there's a constant obscuring of accountability over the severe environmental degradation of palm oil plantations. So it always looks like it's difficult to ever determine who's really responsible for deforestation. In both cases, we see mobilization of formal and informal violence by the state if there are, people either, movements against these forms, the embedding of these regimes of accumulation. That's probably all I want to say. I would just finish on the last comment, which is just that obviously the other interesting thing about this study, or one of the more kind of conclusions that we draw in relation to The more liberal literature, in a sense, is that, you know, even in Southeast Asia is often held up as being, you know, these are examples of development. These are held up by the World Bank and others as bits of kind of poverty alleviation. But even today, we see that you know, these regimes of accumulation are defined by violence and mass poverty. And arguably Southeast Asia, in many parts of Southeast Asia at least, is still sort of in a subordinate relation to the core. That's me.
Thank you very much, Joe. And so we'll move straight to our second paper. So Rafael and Pedro, the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you very much. Pedro and I were not as advanced in our paper as Joe and Pablo are in theirs. We're still at an initial stage, but it's interesting to see how much their paper dialogues with ours in specific points. So we're very interested in taking a fresh look at a debate that occurred between Rui Mauro Marini and Fernando Henrique Cardoso in the 60s and 70s. Our interest in bringing this debate back, it's not just happening in a vacuum. Like in Brazil and in Latin America in general, there has been a resurgence in interest in Marxist dependency theory. And even in Europe, we've seen some instances of new developments in this area. And the debate specifically between the two, it's very it left a very strong mark within Latin American literature, Latin American social thought, especially because only parts of it were put out there into the English-speaking world. Most of you must have heard of Cardoso and Faleto. They have published widely in English, whereas Marini has not. Marini has very few publications in English, and most of his works are only in Spanish. And the interesting is that not to criticize Joe and Pablo, but the concept that John Smith brings, a super exploitation, it's not his actually, it's Marini's, right? Marini works with, Smith works with Marini's work. So what we want to do by relooking at this debate is to understand what the implications of their thought is for the construction of paths, you know, for peripheral and semi-peripheral countries, and specifically at meta-theoretical and theoretical and geopolitical implications, right? With a focus on agency, right? So what can we do? What have we attempted to do? What have we not attempted to do? And how is all this relevant? You know, and how is the fact that Cardoso's perspective was the one that actually succeeded in putting itself out there in the English-speaking world? What effect did that have? You know, and once the dictatorship ended in Brazil and Cardoso was embraced within Brazilian academia and Marini was kind of shrugged aside, what effects did that have on the paths taken within academia and within politics in general? So there's all questions that we don't necessarily directly question all of them, but they're all intertwined into how we're looking at this particular problem. Pedro's going to talk to us a little bit more about the polemic specifically. Pedro?
Right. So as Rafael said, we're taking the debate between Cardoso and Marini in the 70s as the opening point to engage with the different conceptions of dependency theory itself and the different versions, different interpretations of dependency of the dependentista thought that can be found and in order to enrich the current debates around dependency. So what exactly is the debate between Cardoso and Marini, and how, in what is that about? What are they discussing? So we are emphasizing as our starting point a review published by Cardoso and Serra in the Mexican Journal of Revista Mexicana de Sociología in '78, which is a review of Marini's Dialectic of Dependency, of Marini's book. And they write a very strong critique of Marini, they are very dismissive of Marini's work. And their critique is essentially grounded on accusations of structuralism. So they're saying Marini does not account for the specificities of Latin American development because they're all subsumed to the general laws, contradictions, and logics of capitalism, which is a kind of conversation that we as Marxists, we in HM are very familiar with. This accusation, and especially in 1970, around 1970s Marxism, it's a common thread of accusation. It's a common accusation of this highly orthodox structuralist Marxism that is tied to the history of capital itself and its implications on everything else. And they're saying that to make their own argument that Cardoso presents in his book with Faleto, that dependency cannot be conceived as this insurmountable obstacle for development, right? That there must be a way to achieve development from the South. And the problem with Marini, they say, is that he does not acknowledge that he frames dependency as this overarching structure that cannot be washed away from the historical trajectories of the periphery. And while they do have a point that that I would agree with, that this kind of structuralism that dismisses history is indeed a bad thing that should be avoided, the point we're making is that in order to to frame Marini's argument within that conception, it involves a lot of straw manning. It involves many misinterpretations of Marini's arguments, some of them intentional misinterpretations of Marini's arguments that related to political reasons involved with Cardoso and Serra's own positions as within Brazilian politics that they are trying to establish in the late 70s and 80s as presenting a pathway to redemocratization in Brazil. They're writing this during the Brazilian dictatorship, and involved in this debate is not only the point we're making is that this is a debate that goes beyond the theoretical interpretations of dependency, and involves also what to do in Brazil in the context of the dictatorship, and how to move beyond, what to do with Brazilian redemocratization from the 80s onwards. So about this, and especially if we consider the current literature on dependency, right? It is if you read what has been published on dependency theory over the past 3 years, it seems inconceivable to think of to present Marini as this orthodox Marxist, right? If anything, Marini is now acknowledged as this theorist from the South, right? That presents important theoretical innovations to, open quote, traditional Marxism, close quote, on which includes, as Rafael mentioned before, overexploitation, sub-imperialism. There are many aspects of Marini's interpretation of dependency that can push us in innovative and different ways that have been explored by this recent literature. But so, and we're framing this discussion to, and I want to finish soon, to ask questions about the geopolitical implications of this debate, and how they speak of their own meta-theoretical conceptions of how to interpret theory and history, and how to frame dependency within this what role dependency plays in the respective conceptions of theory and history. So returning to this to that debate, so Cardoso is saying that dependency is not this insurmountable obstacle, right? So there is a way to achieve development of some sort from the periphery, and that is detailed in his book with Faleto, right? It essentially boils down to this construction of a broad social alliance that encompasses different fractions of the bourgeoisie as well as the working classes, and which, as we had the opportunity to see during the 90s when he became president, and when Serra, his co-author of this paper where they critique Marini, was one of his most influential ministers. This boils down into what became known as this path of associated development, right? Because it involves it was deeply tied to this proximity with the US for the attraction of foreign capital through IMF loans, privatizations, through the negotiation of the free trade area of the Americas. It was a big thing at the time. So essentially, the geopolitical implications of this strategy that they point us towards is not significantly different from a neoliberal form of a neoliberal conception of development, a neoliberal strategy. And in this is already pointed out by Marini himself in his response to the critique of Cardoso and Serra, when Marini highlights that that's the strategy that they're pointing towards, this strategy of a broad class alliances towards the achievement of development as this goal, right? This development as with the sense of producing a homogeneous endpoint towards which all societies are driven, inexorably driven in a way, is essentially a return to Rostov's conception, right? Is essentially the same kind of developmentalism, and indeed Marini coins the term neo-developmentalism, responding to Cardoso and Serra. But then again, as I was saying earlier, to frame Marini's conception of development as this orthodox Marxism is a deep misconception of what he's doing, of his work. It's a strong misinterpretation of dialectics of dependency, of development and underdevelopment or revolution. And because Marini does see three or four different paths of well, I'm going to say development, but with let me move on, which might or not open possibilities for overcoming the dependency problem, right? So there is, and here sub-imperialism plays an important role, because it is one of the main alternatives, right? So there is a possibility of promoting social change by reproducing the imperialist strategies of the core with the periphery, and then thereby expanding its geopolitical domination over a periphery of the periphery, through which he calls sub-imperialism, would open up the possibility for some kind of development / under-development in the South. And there's also the option that what we are calling the subservient alternative, which is what we call Cardoso's strategy, the strategy that Cardoso enacted during the 90s and proposed during the 70s. And of course, Marini also envisages a possibility of actually overcoming dependency by actually overcoming super exploitation and capitalism, which is the revolutionary path that he has in mind as his main example, the Cuban experience through the 1960s when he was writing in the 70s. And I would like to move on to speak about the different how this conceives, how these speaks of different connections between conceptions of development and relationships between politics and economics in their views, in their theories, like the meta theoretical implications of these arguments. For instance, in Cardoso frames his argument as one that acknowledges agency, but at the same time, agency is limited to non-revolutionary paths, which is a consequence of his conception of development, which is limited to capitalist development. So the political options that his agency accounts for are political options within the modern sovereign state, within the, if you want, the dependent state, within dependent capitalism, within capitalism itself. And Marini, by taking a broader, encompassing a broader connection between politics and economics and the role of the state itself, actually provides a more encompassing role of agency, has a different, can enable agency to do to have a more significant role in historical developments. And I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both of you. We'll now move to our third paper. Monica will do the presentation, and then there'll be time for questions and remarks. So again, you can write your questions and your remarks in the chat, and please do so already so that I can share them with the speakers. Monica, the floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you. Actually, our paper is somewhat different to the other two, but I think it kind of connects quite well, because whilst the previous two, I think, kind of emphasize some of the domination structures of processes of capitalist accumulation in the global South and how to interpret them, we are very much going to be discussing a situation of what we've called almost a revolutionary upheaval in the global North, but in a kind of semi-peripheral location. So let me get on with it. So the context that we're going to be discussing is primarily the events around the 1st of October referendum in Catalonia in 2017, and particularly the period that starts at the beginning of September of 2017 and ends with the general strike of the 3rd of October 2017. So pretty much like a month, about 5 weeks of a period of revolutionary upheaval. And we particularly want to focus on the institutions, the actual formal political institutions. So our question is whether, how and when do institutions become a disrupting or rupturing element within the context of authoritarian neoliberalism? And as we started kind of doing research on this, we realized that there is ample literature on civil disobedience. And, if people have been talking about civil disobedience for really 50 years, if not 2000 years. But there is a void in understanding institutional disobedience. And we think it's important to start filling that void, because more and more we're seeing examples where that happens. For example, in the US, we saw sanctuary cities actually refusing to support federal government's policies or even state policies. We've seen, for example, in Houston, and the local police department refusing to collaborate with ICE. And we've also seen elements of institutional disobedience by the mayor of Washington, D.C. in the context last year of Black Lives Matter. So we're seeing more and more of those. In fact, we're also seeing the opposite. We are also seeing institutional disobedience in regressive ways. So as we're seeing at the moment with SB 8, the anti-abortion legislation in Texas. So we certainly are seeing that happening. We think it's important to try and understand it. So we then kind of zoom into the Spanish context and look at what's happening. So we argue that in the Spanish state, in the context of Spain, we're witnessing rising authoritarian neoliberalism. That's within a context of the post-Francoist dictatorship, parliamentarism, that it's very much in name only, as there are not that many deliberations in parliament. A lot of the legislation is actually done by royal decrees. And so it's very much a kind of majority party type of rule in the context of a constitutional monarchy, a place where actually the rule of law is considered more important than democratic rights. And so the rule of law in Spain, because of a context of a post-dictatorship process, was very much designed for stability, with very much a sense of an aversion to change. And a very politicized constitutional tribunal. I'm not going to go through all of those, although if people are interested, that's something that we can provide additional resources. And a very rigid constitution. So in the 43 years of the constitution, there have only been 2 changes to that constitution, 2 amendments. The first one was Article 135, which was the article that enshrined austerity within the constitution, so that it placed a 3% deficit cap as part of the austerity measures after the 2008 global financial crisis, and changes to the hereditary monarchy. Prior to these changes, the monarch had to be a male, so it had to be the male progenitor, but as it happens, the current king only had daughters, and so they changed the constitution so that his daughters could become queens. Those are actually the only 2 changes that the Spanish constitution has had in 43 years. Within the context of the referendum, we argue that also, so we have the context of authoritarian neoliberalism on the one hand, and then we have the context of historical memory and historical experience. And that historical memory and experience very much falls within what we call recent experiences of performative sovereignty. So very much movements of resistance and protest, particularly over the last decade, where people have performed sovereignty by, for example, occupying buildings owned by banks and rehousing people, or, for example, occupying squares during the 2011 cycle of struggles, but also during the 1st of October itself, actually occupying schools and organizing the ballot boxes. And we've put a quote there from one of the songs that were made for the 1st of October referendum. We put it in Catalan, but what that quote actually says is, we're not being fed by crumbs anymore. They're not nutritious enough. We actually want the full loaf of bread. And that very much has a deep connection to historical memory. If we think back to a previous revolutionary period in our context, which was the 1930s, in 1931, we had what many have called the breaking from below. So another dictatorship was broken from the local town halls, where in 1931, they declared the Second Spanish Republic from the municipalities. That was in a context that you didn't have general elections or nation-statewide elections. And so since the only elections allowed were the municipalities themselves organized and against the state, against a dictatorship. And within that context, both in 1931 and 1934, we had previous declarations of the Catalan Republic. So there was an element of something of what, again, back in Catalonia, we call the kind of the red thread of history. And if we go into the concept that we're advancing in this paper, which is institutional disobedience, we argue that this is actually a very rare moment, right? So we're not necessarily saying that this can be replicated either in Catalonia or elsewhere, because many, many different conditions have to happen. But the institutional disobedience that we witnessed during that period highlights a contradiction between the rule of law and democratic practices. There were two instances where that institutional disobedience was at its highest point, which was the 6th and 7th of September, where the Catalan parliament approved two pieces of legislation. The first one was the legislation that would allow the referendum to happen, and the second one, the legal basis of a Catalan republic. Then on the 20th of September, we see a large revolutionary moment in a sense, because several government buildings and the building and the headquarters of the CUP party, which is a Catalan anti-capitalist party, became under siege by Spanish police. And that siege lasted several hours, more than 12 hours. So it was very much a revolutionary moment, at least in how people certainly felt it. Then that led to the 1st of October referendum. And that's where we argue the institutional disobedience really kind of occurs. Because unlike in previous attempts, there were attempts in 2010 and 2014. And so in 2014, for example, more than 2 million people actually voted in another so-called illegal referendum, but that was without the support of the Catalan government. In the 2017 referendum, the Catalan government was actually key in organizing the referendum. And so why would a government engage in a subnational government engage in disobeying the state? Had huge consequences, because as you're aware, what happened afterwards meant that the entire government had to actually either go on exile or be imprisoned for nearly 3 years. So why would they do that? Well, the first reason is the strength of grassroots mobilizing. They had to do, in a sense, what society called them to do. And that was because it was really so strong. There was a widespread situation of civil disobedience. So a lot of those actions were happening everywhere. And the institutional disobedience was not just by the formal political institutions. So it wasn't just by the parliament and the Catalan government. So not just by the executive and the legislative branch, but also by firefighters, for example, that came out and supported the people against the police. So they put themselves in front of anti-riot police to defend people. Schools disobeyed. They actually handed out their keys so that people could use the schools as electoral colleges during the referendum. And these are just some of the images at the time. This is the image I was referring to in terms of the firefighters opposing with their bodies the anti-riot police. So why is this significant? Why should we care, besides what we might care in Catalonia? Well, the 1st of October, we argue, is part of a long tradition of struggle. It connects with some of the movements we had during the 1980s and 1990s, anti-militaristic movements of disobedience. At the time, Spain had a mandatory military service for men. And so all men had to go and serve in the military for 9 months of their lives. And so that led to large movements of civil disobedience. And Catalonia was one of the core places where that developed. The auto-globalization movement of the 1990s and 2000s, which already developed very broad social and political coalitions. The anti-war movement of the early 2000s, and of course the last decade with anti-austerity movements such as the 15M or the movement for housing rights and the IPA. And that very much, those anti-austerity movements were very much characterized by direct action and engaging in disobedience, and the importance of resisting bodies. So for example, the housing movement, the movement against mortgages, it was based around stopping housing evictions by placing a lot of people outside of the home where somebody was going to be evicting. And we're very successful at doing that. And so we argue that we're very much kind of seeing a self-determining process. So for example, with the 15M, the 2011 vision of squares, we had the slogans, "You don't represent us," "Real democracy now." Slogans that very much represented a critique of capitalist relations, whilst simultaneously confronting the political power of the state. So those, in a sense, started planting the seeds in people. And there was also a new kind of communal political rationality that emerged. And it's not only about having and exerting rights, but also experimenting with and developing new democratic ways to manage resources and collective life. So in that sense as well, the strength of the feminist movement, particularly in the second half of this last decade, and issues to do with women's strikes and some of other issues have also created more consciousness in terms of that self-determining process. It has also then brought contradictions into the institutions. So one of the outcomes of the anti-austerity struggles of the last decade has been an increasing radicalization of groups and new groups that have entered the institutions, from the coup, which we have two examples there with David Fernandez, one of the early MPs from the coup, and then we also have from Podemos and again from the coup. So we have very much high levels of contradictions, but engagement with the institution, right? So, sorry, I'm aware of time and I've got a lot done. So by collecting the accumulated learning of that recent cycle of struggles, of those kind of anti-austerity struggles, the resistance and disobedience of the 1st of October, we argue, was very much the construction of a collective and collectivized democratic space, an opportunity to build a new relationship between state and society, and here would be that new possible state, where collective self-management is not only possible, but also becomes an emancipatory claim. An opportunity to build a new society where women's rights, housing rights, access to public healthcare and education, as well as other social and political rights become achievable. And so it also became an opportunity to build a Republic of Catalonia, a kind of a new type of republic. Something similar in a sense, because I think the movement has often been characterized as a kind of nationalistic movement. And I think for many involved in the movement has very much been a movement in line of what James Connolly had argued. And we're also using one of the slogans from the song that we were talking about, the crumbs and the bread, that talks, we're not here to wave flags. This is not a situation of building a state by planting a different flag to the one we had before. And so, James Connolly, there's quite a famous quote from 1897, where he says, if you remove the English army tomorrow and hoist the green flag over Dublin Castle, which is where the English army used to be based, unless you set about the organization of the Socialist Republic, your efforts will be in vain. England will still roll you. So for Catalonia, that's exactly the same. You can change the Catalan flag for the Spanish flag tomorrow. But unless there is the basis of a new emancipatory society, Spain will still rule you, or the EU, or however, in fact, capitalist interests will still rule you. And so in conclusion, we argued that institutional disobedience, while rare, it might increasingly happen when pushed by strong grassroots movements of civil disobedience. The increasing disconnect between the judiciary, the executive powers at the level of the nation state, and subnational levels of government are creating those opportunities for institutional disobedience to happen. And finally, the core argument in a sense is that in a context of authoritarian neoliberalism, the state shields itself from emancipatory popular demands. So we're not living in those kind of supposedly golden age of capitalism in the 1950s or 60s or 70s, where the state might accept certain demands by trade unions or by generally organized labor or other social movements. We're past that. Authoritarian neoliberalism in our modern states really doesn't give a crap about what popular movements might be calling for. And so we actually think that the state itself shields itself, and simultaneously, it shields itself from progressive demands, but actually it absorbs regressive populist claims. And so it is through that kind of grassroots organizing and capturing, even if it is momentarily, subnational institutions might also help in that direction. And I'll leave it here.
Thank you so much, Monica, and all our speakers. We now have time for questions or for remarks. We haven't received any questions so far. I think our viewers are glued to their screens listening to your presentation, so I'll leave some more time for people to do that if they so desire. We can also use the opportunity perhaps for speakers to react to each other. If if you are moved to do so, you can indicate or place a remark in the chat. I think there's quite a bit of overlap in trying to think about the state, about authoritarianism, about different themes of coercion, both sort of internationally and locally, and so perhaps interesting kind of cross reflections are possible here also. I saw Joe sort of moving towards the screen. I don't know if that means that you were moved to remark on another paper, if you were just moving. But if you would want to remark, you're of course welcome to do so. I see no further movement on our YouTube page.
I would like to comment,
please,
if possible. Well, Monica and Clara's paper, I thought that an interesting intersection with our own developments in Pedro lines is this look at real possibilities within these situations, right? I think you very rightly commented that we don't necessarily have to look at if this can be reproduced elsewhere, because there are so many different elements that came together to make this an actual possibility, right? And I think that what we're trying to do with our paper is also look at make an honest reading, develop an honest reading of both Cardoso and Marini to see how they thought of these things back in the 60s, and to see how we can get these insights for analyses today, right? I think it's especially interesting to look at to think about how Cardoso left from being a scholar to become a politician, right? And to see the implications in real life of his contributions, and even to see how his contributions as a politician, as well as Lula's contribution as a politician, both of those alternatives that were sought out, both of those paths, they are considered as possibilities within Marini's work, right? And some of this new literature that we were mentioning, it specifically looks at the periphery within Europe, right? To try to understand the particularities of capitalist development in Europe's periphery, right? So I wanted to see if you could comment on any of that. And also going back to Joseph, within the same idea, you're adopting some concepts from different theoretical schools within the Marxist research program. And I wanted to see, in this regard, of possibilities that are open. What have you seen in the literature that you've consulted, or what's your own perspective in this sense that's open within those two case studies that you analyzed?
Thank you, Rafael. We also have a comment in the chat from Andy Higginbottom. He says there is a strong unity between the first two papers. Rafael is right that Marini really developed the concept of super exploitation in a systematic way. However, it is also a touchstone politically for seeking a combination of anti-imperialism with class analysis. So here is a comment that you can react to. And then we have a question specifically for Monica from Panagiotis. The fact of how aspects of a reactionary populism are part of the discourse of the contemporary authoritarian neoliberal regime, isn't it an attempt to offer some pseudo-popular unity? And Paul points out that I missed part of Andy's comment. The third form of surplus value idea suggests we need to rethink Marxist capital to include the realities of imperialism. Is this project of interest, and how can we work in coordination? So there are a question both of a relationship between anti-imperialism and class analysis on the one hand, and how imperialism might need to inform a rereading or reworking of Marx's Capital, and then a question for Monica about reactionary populism and the danger of pseudo-popular unity. So perhaps if we can move again in the same order, so we'll start with Joe and move through our speakers that way.
Can I just say I'm really fading? It's 3 a.m. here, right? So I think that what we're trying to do with this paper is probably depart a little bit from more kind of almost macro or kind of geopolitical analyses of like dependency or these kind of geopolitical debates, and to really kind of zone in on exactly how the state intervenes or creates particular sorts of socio-legal, infrastructural contexts. I guess what we're trying to say is like, there does seem to me that there's a deep connection between the way in which the politics kind of unfolds on the ground, in terms of the illicitness of some of the practices, the kind of regimes of deregulation, if you want to call them that the corporations are seeking in the global south, or that come to be, and specific forms of accumulation or specific forms of neo-imperial accumulation. That's what I'm trying to say. I think I'm still working on it. I don't think that really answers the questions there. I mean, I definitely agree with Andy's point there that I think it's interesting to start to think of surplus value and what that means, and how we can rethink Marx's Capital in relation to, thinking through surplus value. Definitely. That's all I want to say. So I'm sorry, guys. I'm really struggling now. So, but I'm interested to know what everyone else has to say as well.
Thanks, Joe, and we salute your determination and what's the word I'm looking for? Participation in the HM project under such conditions. Maybe it can sort of lift inhibitions, through sleep deprivation, and you'll come through incredible breakthroughs in the process. So Rafael and Pedro, do you wanna go next?
I think we can answer together. Maybe Pedro, just a quick reaction for Joseph. I think my main idea with my question was to think about, okay, so we have all these pressures coming in from the outside, and we have domestic pressures that are supporting these outside pressures, and the population is being super exploited, and the environment as well. I don't know if you want to use that term for the environment as well. Some do. Have recently used it, but what can be done? Like, how can we think about the internal forces organizing themselves to react to this? Like, what are those possibilities, right? And within the same sense that Monica and Clara were speaking or presenting, that within these Catalan's particularities, there was this possibility that opened up, right? So I think we have to do this dialectical conversation about actions and reactions and possibilities and how to move on. So we can think about how to confront all of this. And this kind of brings me into Andy's first comment about the combination of anti-imperialism with class analysis. I think that one thing that is very important is to regard at what it means to overcome dependency within the capitalist system, right? Like one of the options that Pedro was talking about is that Marini analyzes how there there was within like Brazilian social thought from the 30s to the 60s, this idea of us achieving autonomous capitalist development. So basically of us having a bourgeois revolution of our own, you know, so that we could overcome dependency within capitalism, right? But like to overcome dependency within capitalism means that we would become imperialist ourselves, right? So what does this mean for working class solidarity, you know? And the other option that doesn't look to break with dependency, one of them is to seek to develop sub-imperialism, right? In which we try to export some of our contradictions to alleviate the tensions inside the country, right? By super exploiting other countries, right? So Brazil under Lula, for example, developed, had this policy of trying to internationalize Brazilian multinational companies. So support like these big Brazilian multinational companies to go to Africa, to go to other Latin American countries, to the Middle East, to extract value and bring it back to Brazil, right? So that's another option within capitalism that doesn't seek to break with dependency, right? And it doesn't seek to break with this whole paradigm of exploitation and super exploitation, right? So if we're thinking about class solidarity and anti-imperialism, it's not just about what you do within your country. You know, it's about what you do in your country, how it affects other countries as well, right? So we have to think about all of that in relation to each other. Well, a big critique that has been given in a lot of these trade talks is that a lot of times, like richer countries will want to put labor standards within trade deals, right? But what that might translate into concretely is just that less industry in the periphery, you know, so less jobs in the periphery. So if what we want to do is compete for jobs instead of rethinking the whole system, then you're not really helping the working class in poorer countries, right? It's not really as much solidarity in that sense. So what I think that Andy might be suggesting, or I'm putting it out there at least, is that we have to rethink our whole strategy for class struggle, you know? So we have to rethink the whole idea of workers unite, you know? I'll let Pedro maybe answer the second question or comment on that as well if he wants.
Yeah, I guess like of everything that's happening here, the one thing that captured my mind and got me thinking was this comment by Andy on how we need to rethink Marx capital to include the realities of imperialism. And I think if that is the case, then in worst case scenario, right, we're not starting from scratch. This has people have been doing it, since Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg, including Marini and Cardoso, if you want to give him that. I don't. And the like we have been thinking about these interconnections between capital accumulation, international relations. What does it mean for imperialism, and how to think all of that from the perspective of class struggle, like how to and going back to what we, Rafael and I, are thinking about dependency in particular. I think the question that is raised from this perspective is what does it mean to highlight the specificities of the geopolitical interconnections, the geopolitical strategies of accumulation that constitute dependency itself, right? Which I think has a lot to do with Joseph's paper, and has a lot of interconnections with Monica and Clara's as well, especially in when we ask the question of right. So what does sovereignty mean? What difference sovereignty makes in this scenario, right? What do we use sovereignty for? Yeah, and I'm navigating through these questions in that way. That's it.
Thank you both. Monica and or Clara?
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to start with kind of Rafael's comments and kind of question a little bit, because I agree that, you know, there were kind of some elements, I think, that touch between your paper and ours quite deeply. I have to accept that I'm actually not familiar with Marini. I had read a little bit of him about a decade ago, and I haven't, but I do teach some kind of basic dependency theory in my intro to political economy class, and I keep it quite basic. But one of the things that I have gone through is a little bit of Cardoso, particularly in his response to people like André Gunther Frank and some of the more structuralist dependency theories. So I have a basic kind of bit of knowledge. And I think what's kind of interesting, perhaps, is that at least in the small knowledge I have of that, is that I find Cardoso's focus on agency, it's still very much, and that's the work I've done over the last decade, it's very much based around focus on domination. So it's an agency that it's local, but it's an agency that focuses on corruption and local elites. And it's not so much an emancipatory agency. And I think you're spot on in highlighting, and the reason why it's not an emancipatory agency is because clearly Cardoso is not an emancipatory guy. And so he's not looking to subvert capitalism, right? Highlighted, what he's looking is to create a new type of capitalism that, in a sense, supersedes dependency, but not capitalist accumulation. And so in a sense, it's important, particularly when we focus on agency, because part of the argument I've been building for a decade now, which is to focus on disruption and subversion when we think about the political economy and processes of capitalist accumulation, is precisely the need to look at that agency, but to look at the agency that's emancipatory and subversive, not necessarily the other types of agency which exist as well. And I'm not saying we should be looking at those, just I'm not looking at them in a sense. I think that they're important, but they're not necessarily the ones that will help us create an anti-capitalist future or a post-capitalist future, right? And so it depends on what we do critical social science for, you know, ultimately that's what it is. And so that kind of connects me a little bit with Panagiotti's question, which I think it's kind of a really good question, because something that has been happening very much for the last, particularly since 2016, with the rise of Trump in the US and, you know, Brexit and the way that the whole Brexit debate was framed in Britain, we have seen this reactionary populism, and a reactionary populism that has, in a sense, probably presented an argument against some of the things I have been arguing in terms of anti-austerity movements and other elements. So many of us in 2014-15 saw almost revolutionary moments everywhere. And clearly those moments were not perhaps as revolutionary. And even when we look at Catalonia and we look at the 5 weeks that Clara and Shaun and I are kind of focusing on, if we actually look at some of what has happened since, has been very much a reactionary populism as well. So whilst we might have those kind of 5 weeks that I think are worth studying and understanding, then we also need to understand that reaction. And so, yes, of course, it is an attempt to offer that pseudo-popular unity that Panagiottis talks about. In fact, some of the work I'm doing on authoritarian neoliberalism argues that if the authoritarian neoliberal project that very much is initiated between 2010 and 2012 within many European countries, and one that actually we have seen, and people that have done research on authoritarian neoliberalism in places like Turkey, or even some work that's coming out of Brazil now, or some work on Mexico and works on other places, probably kind of having more advanced in developing that, is that this is not a state project, or this is not simply a state project. And so authoritarian neoliberalism, whilst when we started thinking about it, particularly after Ian Brough's article in 2014, we think of it in terms of state and the economy, what has happened after 2016 is that has become very much a societal project. And so we probably need to bring that kind of authoritarian populism that was very much a good explanation to understand Thatcherism in the 80s back to try and understand it now, but also with what's happening in our societies. Brazil is a great example with Bolsonaro, but also what's happening in many other societies of this. And I'm not sure if it translates in English that well, but in Catalonia and in Spain, we're using very much that concept, which is the fascistization of society, right? Where it's actually society is becoming fascist in a way. So it's increasingly, it's certainly the case. I'm in Texas, where you can't even say words like critical race theory, or you cannot even say reproductive rights without being persecuted by people for being some sort of mad radical communist. And so things that perhaps 10 years ago were just absolutely normal and even kind of relatively liberal claims, they're now turning out to be extremely radical claims. And I think we need to understand a lot more that in that interaction and that dialectical relationship actually between state apparatus, the different elements of capitalist fractions and how they relate to that fascistization of society.
Thank you very much to all of you. We have about 10 minutes left, and we have one more question in the chat. So I'll pose it now. I mean, I guess it's primarily directed at Rafael and Pedro, but HM is a democratic space, so feel free to respond to it if you also moved to. So Mateus Daltoe Assis is asking, what do you think about the new approaches that make Marini a developmentalist? And then clarifies, in Brazil, dependency theory has been appropriated by neo-developmentalist politicians to build anti-Marxist projects.
I'd say that Marini isn't the one who's being appropriated. I think that maybe the other variants of dependency theory, yes, right? Because I've seen a similar criticism coming from the colonial theory or theorists, in which saying that like even Marxist dependency theory falls into like this Eurocentric developmentalist fallacy because it sees development as a positive thing. And I think that it's an important critique, and I think that it should instigate us to ask ourselves what we understand as development and what we want from development, right? Precisely in the direction that Joe and Pablo took their presentation, right? In considering the ecological lens of imperialism and development, right? But if we also consider that development is concerned with improving the well-being of society and of its population, right? But that doesn't necessarily have to be contrasted with the well-being of nature, then we can reconsider that critique, right? What I meant when I say that Mateus's comment that Marini's dependency theory or Marxist dependency theory hasn't been appropriated in the sense that he says is because those who have appropriated dependency thought in general are more in line with Cardoso's associated independent development, right? In other words, that we should keep within the margins given by the system so we can get the most out of it, right? So a lot of neo-developmentalism in Brazil falls within this line, right? Of not critiquing, of not going against exploitation or super exploitation, and not analyzing the international relations between countries and of the international relations of exploitation between countries, right? So I don't see how anybody could read Marini and appropriate him in this way, but I can see how you could read Cardoso and appropriate him in this way.
Joe, yes, please.
Yeah, sorry. To go back to Andy's earlier comment, I'm just thinking about it now, and actually some of the things that Rafael was saying as well. I think, thinking of the third form of surplus value, I mean, I really like the idea of super exploitation. I think it represents a certain sort of simplicity and abstraction, which is really politically powerful. And I think that's why it's kind of an appealing idea. I guess one thing with like trying to work with it, you know, in the nitty gritty is the role of, if you look, for example, in, you know, the development of export processing zones around Southeast Asia, there's lots and lots of intermediary capital involved. So it's not just that surplus value is being transferred sort of or redistributed, say, from, I don't know, Cambodia to Germany or something. There's also Taiwanese firms and Taiwanese capital involved in the development of export processing zones. And another thing as well of thinking about, you know, I mean, I guess this is the interesting thing, isn't it? It's like to try and think about how do we keep developing this idea of super exploitation, or I guess that's why I'm sort of interested in thinking about, is also the way in which, you know, if you take export processing zones again in the Mekong region, is actually there's all these inequalities which are constantly being exploited to divide the working class solidarity in a way. So you've got genders always mobilized, citizenship, race, even, do you know what I mean? So that's also significant for thinking through surplus value and whose labor is valued and whose labor is disvalued and what role that has in breaking down solidarities as well. So I know that wasn't really exactly anything to do with what Rafael was just talking about, but it was more just was thinking of Andy's question earlier, and what the challenges are for thinking through super exploitation.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Would any of our speakers still like to react to anything that's been asked or said? Monica, yes, please.
Just to both the other papers, I suppose, and kind of prompted a little bit by Joe's comment now, I think, and actually something that Rafael said earlier, which is kind of I think you highlighted the idea of workers unite and how kind of how can that be difficult. And that made me think, because that's always, you know, that's always what we want, but it's also always a highly problematic characterization. So as soon as you said it, it always makes me think of the early 20th century when primarily English trade unionists moved to South Africa and created some trade unions in South Africa. And their slogan was "White workers of the world unite." And of course, that was also a slogan used later by English fascists in football grounds, that thankfully at the time the unions kind of did not go with it, but certainly it has been there. So I think that's always problematic. And I think it's often problematic in the export processing zones, as you were talking about as well, because I think that's perhaps where our papers connect a little bit. So I actually live in an export processing zone on the US-Mexico border. And I've just recently published something on authoritarian neoliberalism here. Around the issues of the border wall, and some of the work I'm doing actually is looking precisely, because just 20 miles from where I am, it's where some of the main maquiladoras, the production plants, manufacturing plants in Mexico are. And so the side where I'm in is kind of where the warehousing and distribution occurs. And so there's some really fascinating elements, because just before the pandemic, the maquiladora workers on the other side of the border went on strike for about 3 to 4 months. And so there is a few plants there. There's a Coca-Cola plant, and there is a Panasonic plant, and Samsung has a plant there. And they all achieved huge salary increases. So they actually went, it was about, in some cases, it was over 25% of a salary increase. Whilst at the same time, the workers on the US side of the border in kind of warehousing and distribution centers, they are the least unionized workers in the United States, and with the lowest salaries. I had one of my graduate students did some research looking at the corporations that had warehousing facilities here, and looking at the hourly rate paid to the workers here compared to in other US states. And they were at least 30 to 40% lower for the same corporation and the same type of warehousing or distribution work. And so obviously the being in the export processing zone, particularly when you have a bordering between two countries. Obviously, it's more exaggerated here because it's Mexico and the US. But of course, those kind of inequalities between those two countries can really exacerbate the dependency in the sense that those workers will experience and the ability to organize. And it doesn't always work in the way that you expect. So I just kind of thought that was something interesting. It doesn't have to do with Catalonia, but
unacceptable. You're only allowed to make comments about Catalonia given your paper. Thank you so much. We're sort of coming towards the end of our time. We haven't had further questions, so perhaps if any of our speakers would like to give any concluding thoughts or remarks, I can give you a couple of minutes each to do so. So you can indicate if you wanted to, and if you feel like you've said what needs to be said, we can thank our viewers and move on. Rafael, yes, please.
I wasn't going to raise my hand because I've spoken a lot in this second part of the session, but nobody did. Well, I wanted to react a little bit to Monica's comment. I just want to emphasize that I put that we should rethink this whole idea of workers reunite, not go back to it necessarily, but thank you for your comments in that direction. It's more in the sense of worker solidarity, you know, and working class solidarity that I think we have to think about when constructing our domestic strategies, not to be closed off within our own borders, you know, when we think of that. And this kind of also goes back to Andy Higginbottom's question, right, about the third form of surplus value and the project of, if this, he was asking us to, instigating us at the end, he says, is this a project of interest, and how can we work in coordination, right? So I think the first idea is for us to try to think what this category actually suggests of super exploitation, right? And it's not just a quantitative differentiation between exploitation and super exploitation. There's a big qualitative differentiation there, you know, where a worker doesn't receive even the minimum that's necessary for dignity, you know. And I think it's important for us to understand how this is happening in different countries, how widespread this is and has been within the global South, within the periphery and semi-periphery, and how that's becoming an increasingly, how it's become increasingly problematic even in central countries, you know? So it's not, if we think systemically, if we think about anti-imperialist strategies, then it's not about competing within the imperialist system, within the capitalist system. It's about attempting to think in new ways and think of new strategies, not of workers unite, but other ideas that aren't necessarily about going back to the past, but moving forward, right? Thank you.
Thank you. I haven't seen any other hands from our speakers. I think Joe is even shaking his head. I think he would very much like us to allow him to go to bed. So perhaps we'll do that. Let me just thank all of our speakers for excellent papers and for their participation and their insight on each other's works and on the questions that people have asked. Let me also thank our viewers, both live and those who will continue to follow in the days to come. Let me remind you that HM is dependent on your, well, principally on the journal. And so I would very much like you to encourage all our viewers to subscribe to the journal. We currently have a percentage of your subscription, so you can use that throughout the conference. And for all our viewers who work in universities, we'd very much like you to get your libraries to subscribe to the journal, as well as to our book series, and for all of you to take advantage of the 40% off that HM is currently giving you on the HM book series. So you can buy hundreds of books and at the same time, the illusion that you will have the time to read them all. So thanks to all of you, to our speakers and to our viewers. And don't forget that HM continues for another week, and that you can see the timetable on our website. So thank you very much, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you,
everyone.
Sai.
Yeah.
A nice
Nice
meeting
to
you.
meet everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah.